museum of boring things. Tonight's exhibit, the toothpick. A slender shaft of wood, sometimes plastic, sometimes even stainless steel, pointed at both ends, fragile enough to snap between your fingers, yet sturdy enough to dislodge the remnants of a stubborn steak from between molars. The humble toothpick. It waits in dispensers on diner counters, lounges in cocktail olives, and lurks inside cold club sandwiches as a structural support no one asked for, but everyone somehow appreciates. You've used one. You've probably ignored one. But have you ever really considered one? The earliest evidence of toothpick-like tools dates back, brace yourself, not centuries, but millennia. Archaeologists have found signs of toothpick usage in Neanderthal remains. That's right. Long before the wheel or writing or the faintest notion of dental hygiene, early humans were already poking around in their mouths with little sticks. The fossilized tartar on ancient teeth sometimes shows distinctive grooves, the kind only made by regular mechanical cleaning. Picture it, some hairy ancestor, crouching near a fire, wielding a sliver of bone or wood, with the same petty annoyance you feel after popcorn, the impulse to remove what doesn't belong. Food, plaque, discomfort is timeless. So too is the invention that enables it. By the time of the Sumerians, rudimentary tools were crafted not just for function, but for status. Gold toothpicks were found in the tombs of Etruscan nobles. In ancient Rome, the acus dentium was often a luxury item, crafted of silver or ivory, worn on a chain or kept in a pouch. Cleaning one's teeth was a sign of refinement, not hygiene, mind you, that would come much later, but a ritual of class, a performance of order imposed on the chaos of the body. But it wasn't, indeed, until the 19th century that the toothpick began to take on its modern form, mass-produced, disposable, and anonymous. A man named Charles Forster, a name as unremarkable as the object he revolutionized, saw an opportunity not in innovation, but in standardization. The story goes that Forster imported toothpicks from Brazil, where they were carved by hand. Realizing Americans weren't buying enough of them, he did what any ambitious entrepreneur would. He hired Harvard students to go into shops, ask for toothpicks, and walk out when they were told none were available. Then he'd send others in with actual stock. A primitive but effective marketing scheme, and it worked. Demand grew. Toothpicks became not a luxury, not a necessity, but a habit. You might be inclined to scoff at the absurdity of it. Who needs to be sold on toothpicks? And yet, how many things in life are like that? How many customs cling to us, not because they are essential, but because someone insisted, long enough and loud enough, that they ought to be. Forster's mass production relied on machines adapted from the shoe peg industry. Each peg, once meant for holding soles in place, now redirected to the infinitely more dignified task of poking teeth. The design seems simple, too simple. A tapered stick, typically around 6.5 cm long, but within that modest silhouette lies a quiet brilliance. The angle of the taper matters. Too sharp, and it splinters. Too dull, and it fails its one task. The wood must be strong, yet pliable. Birch became the material of choice. Pliable, abundant, clean-burning. In the mid-20th century, some manufacturers even dyed one end red or grooved it, not for function, but for flair. A dash flash of character on an otherwise forgettable thing. And then there is the cocktail toothpick, longer, sometimes adorned with cellophane frills, the closest a disposable implement ever comes to feeling festive. In the right hands or mouths, it becomes a kind of affectation. Think of gangsters in noir films, chewing on one as if to say, "I don't need a cigarette to look tough." Or servers in mid-century restaurants, slipping a toothpick behind the ear like a tiny badge of authority. Function fades into symbol. The stick endures. Even now, you'll find them tucked inside napkin dispensers, hidden in glove compartments, resting silently in their plastic coffin-shaped containers and bathroom drawers. We trust them, not for their strength. Lord knows they snap under pressure, but for their readiness, their availability, their reliability. If the Swiss Army knife is the ultimate symbol of prepared masculinity, then the toothpick is its absurd domestic cousin, always there, never noticed. In 1980, the town of Strong, Maine, claimed to produce 90% of the world's wooden toothpicks. Its factories hummed with the task of turning trees into tools of transient utility. Entire forests reduced to slivers destined to be used once, maybe twice, and discarded. There's something oddly poetic about that, a life compressed into a single act of usefulness. We rarely honor such things. We build museums to paintings, to swords, to typewriters, but to toothpicks, only here, only now. And what of the modern toothpick's lesser-known cousins? The dental pick, the plastic flosser, the little metal gadgets with rotating heads and replaceable tips. Tools of the clinical world, too sterile to charm. But the wooden toothpick, despite its decline in practical utility, has refused extinction. It shows up in lunchboxes, in airline meals, in picnic baskets, often wrapped in tissue-thin paper, an effort to lend it dignity it neither seeks nor needs. Of course, not all uses are dental. Some are architectural. In 2007, a man named Stan Monroe constructed a replica of the Sagrada Familia out of toothpicks. It took him 30,000 of them and several months of work. He also built the Taj Mahal, the Empire State Building, and a dozen other landmarks. The toothpick, it seems, can aspire beyond the crevice of the molar. And yes, there are darker stories too. Hidden blades inside hollow toothpicks used by spies. A fatal stabbing in a Brazilian prison where the weapon of choice was a hardened, sharpened pick. Strange, isn't it? How something meant to clean and maintain can become a vector for harm. But such is the story of most tools. They reflect the hand that wields them more than the purpose they were born to serve. What do we owe a toothpick? Nothing, of course. And yet, if you think of all the awkward moments it has quietly resolved, the silent service rendered in the backs of throats and corners of sandwiches, you begin to wonder, is utility enough to earn remembrance? We stand here tonight not to elevate the toothpick beyond its station, but to acknowledge that station with the seriousness all quiet things deserve. The things that do not demand our attention, but still wait for us in drawers, in dispensers, in our memories. And if you stay just a moment longer, if you let your eyes rest on that plain stick in the glass case, you might feel a small, almost imperceptible shift, a curiosity where there was none, a respect, however slight. And that, in this museum, is enough. Of course, to appreciate the toothpick fully, one must follow its trail not just through time, but through table manners, for what is etiquette if not the architecture of embarrassment, a vast and delicate system designed to keep bodily realities politely hidden. The toothpick, as you might imagine, sits right at the fault line between civility and instinct. In 18th century France, it was considered vulgar to use a toothpick at the table, unless, of course, one did so with elaborate discretion, often behind a handkerchief or screen. Meanwhile, in imperial China, jade toothpicks were given as gifts to court officials, prized not only for their function, but as a kind of moral hygiene, a clean mouth, a clean mind. The object was both literal and metaphorical, a domestic tool and a miniature totem of virtue. In Japan, the tsugagushi, delicately carved from boxwood, was sometimes carried in elegant cases. Not to be used openly, no, that would be crass. Instead, one would excuse themselves quietly and cleanse in private, reappearing with that serene precision the culture so admires. Even in places where hygiene was less advanced, the idea that a toothpick was somehow intimate, a thing both necessary and unseemly, remained strangely universal. But America, predictably, took a different approach. In the 20th century, the toothpick became a post-meal ritual. It wasn't just acceptable, it was expected, especially in diners, truck stops, and steakhouses. Men would lean back in their booths, toothpick between their teeth, and declare their satisfaction with a certain laconic pride. It was almost performative, this chewing, not to clean, but to signify. A kind of working-class semaphore. I've eaten well, and now I rest. There's something democratic about the American toothpick. Mass-produced, free at the counter, a little bit of utility wrapped in a whisper of bravado. It became part of the character wardrobe. The cowboy with a blade of grass, the trucker with a toothpick. And in films, it took on an almost talismanic quality. Clint Eastwood didn't need words. The angle of the pick in his mouth said everything. It became a pause in dialogue, a punctuation mark in masculinity. Interestingly, the material changed as global commerce accelerated. Bamboo became more prominent, especially as sustainability concerns began to nibble at the conscience of the West. Birch forests, once raised for the daily pickings of millions, saw some reprieve as Asian imports filled the shelves. Plastic toothpicks, more hygienic, more durable, also rose in popularity, particularly in medical or travel kits. But they lacked something, a soul perhaps, or at least the satisfying snap of a wooden pick breaking cleanly in two. Speaking of snapping, have you ever noticed how often people fidget with them? It's not merely oral hygiene at play, it's tactile. That subtle bend between the fingers, the twist, the tension, until the thing gives. There's something almost therapeutic about it. A private little act of destruction, one that makes no mess, no noise, and leaves behind nothing but a splinter or two. In a world where we're told not to touch, to control, to type instead of carve, the toothpick remains rebelliously analog. And then there's its architectural paradox. Delicate yet pointed, rigid yet fleeting, like the ephemeral sculptures monks create from sand, only to brush them away moments later. The toothpick is a monument to the momentary. No one keeps a used toothpick. There are no heirlooms here, no engraved sets passed down through generations. They are designed to disappear like footprints on a shore, yet their manufacture is oddly complex. To produce millions of uniform wooden picks, logs are first steamed, then peeled into long, thin sheets, like unspooling a roll of paper from a tree. These sheets are then cut, chopped, sanded, and sharpened. Each step automated, each product identical. There's a kind of eerie perfection in it. A forest enters the factory. A forest leaves in slivers, and in the middle of that transformation lies a question we rarely ask. Is this wasteful or elegant? A single-use object that serves a single purpose with single-minded efficiency. There's something admirable about that. It doesn't pretend to be more. It is the knife without a sheath, the sentence without a clause. Direct, honest, quietly brutal. I've often thought that if alien archaeologists visited Earth centuries from now, they'd be puzzled by toothpicks. Not because of their shape, they'd understand utility, but because of their volume. Billions of them buried in landfills, caught in gutters, sealed in old restaurant packaging. A civilization obsessed with cleaning its teeth, even as it poisoned its air and seas. What would they make of us? That we prized oral purity above planetary health. But maybe I'm being unfair. Maybe the toothpick is less a symbol of waste and more a relic of intention. It tells us something about how much we care, in small ways. About appearance, about detail, about not letting even the smallest discomfort linger. We all have our rituals of control. Mine just happens to involve a museum and far too many glass display cases. There's one particular pick in our collection I find especially charming. It's bent, cracked, and deeply stained, possibly used, though we'll never know by whom. It was recovered from a diner in New Jersey sometime in the 1960s. The napkin it was wrapped in had a lipstick imprint, faint but unmistakable, a ghost of a meal, a presence long vanished, and that toothpick, for all its ordinariness, became the final act of someone's experience, of conversations, of digestion, of a day. That's the thing, you see. It's not just what a tool does, but when it does it. The timing matters. A toothpick isn't useful before the meal, nor during. It has one perfect moment, one window of utility. Miss it, and the thing becomes awkward. Try to pick your teeth too early, and it's rude. Too late, and the debris has moved on, settled, become something else entirely. How many other things in life are like that? Effective only in their moment. Lovers, arguments, jokes, apologies. Miss the beat, and the meaning evaporates. The toothpick, bless its heart, never tries to stay relevant. It simply waits for its cue, takes the stage, performs its modest role, and exits. And here we are, giving it a little applause. Of course, one must acknowledge that the toothpick's story is also a story of the hand, a story of fingers, grip, dexterity, the minute dance of digits trained to perform tasks so specific they border on invisible. Watch someone use a toothpick properly, and you'll see a choreography we almost never think about. The rotation, the angled pressure, the gentle scrape. It's an act that combines precision with instinct, like tuning a violin string or threading a needle in bad light. It is, curiously, a very human gesture. Animals don't use toothpicks, not even the clever ones. Chimpanzees fashion tools, yes, but not for this. The idea of hygiene for its own sake, or perhaps vanity, is uniquely ours. And in that, the toothpick becomes a mirror, not a mirror of the face, but of intent, the desire to correct, to restore, to refine. find what has just been chewed up. You'll find it in cultural ceremonies too. In some Mediterranean cultures, offering a toothpick after a meal is still considered an act of hospitality, a kind of postprandial benediction. It says, "We cared enough to feed you. Now we care enough to let you tidy up." A subtle, silent act of care, the opposite of extravagant generosity. Domestic, contained, but no less meaningful. And yet, the object's quiet ubiquity hides a strangely contested past. Take, for instance, the toothpick wars. Yes, plural. In the late 19th century, multiple companies in the United States fought bitterly over patents related to manufacturing techniques. The legal battles became as sharp as the picks themselves. At one point, there was a suit over whether a particular groove design constituted infringement. Imagine it. Rows of suited men in a courtroom, arguing about notches in wood, and why not? In capitalism, no corner is too small to be monetized, no utility too minor to be owned. But it wasn't just legal, it was cultural. In Boston, where Charles Forster's operations dominated, there were public campaigns to normalize the toothpick. The very idea of carrying them was considered distasteful by some, even un-American by others, as if tidying your teeth in public might invite moral decay. The debate grew so heated that newspapers took sides. A man once wrote to the Boston Globe, complaining that the presence of toothpicks in restaurants was an affront to decency. Others wrote in defense, arguing they were the only thing standing between civilization and spinach. Oddly, it was those very moments of cultural tension that ensured the toothpick's survival, because nothing survives better than a small, useful thing that offends someone. Its controversy was its camouflage. While people argued, it quietly multiplied. But we should not confuse survival with stillness. The toothpick changed. In parts of Southeast Asia, versions emerged with dual functionality, one end for teeth, the other for ears. The logic was simple. Two small tasks, one slim solution. Some were even dipped in clove oil or mint, making them medicinal. In this way, the object escaped its purely mechanical origins and edged closer to the world of health and wellness, a curious migration from the napkin dispenser to the pharmacy shelf. And now, as we tiptoe further into the 21st century, we find the toothpick occupying strange peripheral corners of technology and design. There are carbon fiber picks. Yes, really, for survivalists who believe wood is for the weak. There are reusable picks with titanium shafts and interchangeable heads, sold in sleek matte cases as if dental maintenance had become a Bond gadget. One company even markets them with the tagline, "Engineered for performance." Performance. What a word. It reminds me of a dinner I once attended years ago in Oslo, or was it Zurich, where the final course arrived skewered on an oversized designer toothpick, presented on a slate stone with a micro sprig of something utterly inedible. The pick itself was plated in gold. A waiter, very serious, explained it was to be used and then kept as a memory of the meal. As if the food wasn't enough, as if the experience needed proof. That toothpick now sits in a drawer in my office, beneath a stack of museum access cards and broken reading glasses. I haven't looked at it in years, but it's still there. Unused. Useless, really, but not unmeaningful. You see, when we pick up a toothpick, we don't just perform an act, we rehearse a ritual, a small gesture of maintenance, of order, of return. Something has entered the mouth that does not belong. And now, with quiet determination, we remove it. We restore the body's balance. There is, in that, a kind of modest heroism. Not every object can claim that. Some tools are instruments of force. Hammers, knives, machines. Others are decorative, symbolic, ornamental. But the toothpick sits humbly between the two. Functional, yes. Aesthetic, occasionally. But above all, responsive. It does not impose. It reacts. It waits until needed. And then, just once, it acts. That, I think, is why we keep it around. Despite better technologies, despite the rise of dental floss, mouthwashes, ultrasonic cleaners, and gum stimulators, despite the warnings of dentists who frown upon wooden picks and their splintering risks, despite its fragility, or perhaps because of it, we admire what doesn't demand our admiration. We trust the tool that does its job and quietly retires. There is a beauty in restraint, and the toothpick, mundane, disposable, and mostly forgotten, is restraint made manifest. Some evenings when the museum is empty and the hum of the security system sounds like the sigh of an old man falling asleep in his chair, I find myself drifting back to one particular memory, a rural train station in southern Italy. I was young, traveling with nothing but a notebook and a stubborn conviction that everything ordinary was secretly extraordinary. At the platform cafe, an old man served me espresso with a sliver of lemon peel, and alongside it a single toothpick and wax paper. Not a mint, not a sugar cube, a toothpick, offered like a parting gift from the mouth of the nation itself. I didn't use it. I simply turned it over between my fingers for the rest of the day, as if trying to decode some silent meaning I was too young to understand. Perhaps it was that memory that makes me wonder, when did the toothpick become less of a tool and more of a gesture? We often mistake minimalism for carelessness, but minimalism can be precision, discipline, a refusal to embellish the unnecessary. In that cafe, the toothpick wasn't an afterthought. It was punctuation, the full stop to a meal, the neat little seal on the moment. Something about that has stayed with me longer, truthfully, than the taste of the coffee or the shape of the train. And yet, like all things designed to vanish after use, the toothpick rarely gets a legacy. No monuments, no literary tributes, no sonnets written to its memory. But consider this, even Shakespeare must have used one. So did Gandhi, Darwin, probably even the pharaohs, though theirs were likely gold or bronze, carried by attendants in linen robes. There are objects that every human touches, regardless of era or empire. Fire, bread, rope, and the toothpick. It is part of our shared infrastructure, the connective tissue of the human experience. Not celebrated, no, but necessary. And necessity, though rarely romantic, is profoundly democratic. The toothpick does not care for wealth, class, or nation. It has no political allegiance. It finds its way into palaces and bus stops alike. There's an odd intimacy to the act itself. It takes place inside the mouth, after all, a private theater. Most of our grooming rituals can be shared. Combing hair, adjusting clothing, even brushing teeth has been rendered performative in commercials. But picking teeth, that remains taboo, tucked behind napkins or done in the solitude of bathrooms and back seats. It is closeness with consequence. Too visible, and you risk offense. Too hidden, and you might forget why you do it at all. There's a kind of quiet drama in that, wouldn't you agree? Now, I've seen people use toothpicks as art tools, scraping at dried paint, applying glue in minuscule amounts, shaping fondant on cakes with microscopic detail. I've seen prisoners fashion elaborate lockpicks from modified dental tools. I've heard stories, probably apocryphal, of chefs who test the doneness of a cake, not with steel skewers, but with toothpicks, because only splinters tell the truth. And I once met a woman in Thessaloniki who cleaned her keyboard keys with them, dipping the tip in diluted vinegar and attacking the crumbs like a surgeon with a vendetta. Each time the object becomes something new, yet remains itself. That's the trick, isn't it? A true tool never has just one use. It has one design, but endless applications. The form endures. The function adapts. It's strange, though, how something so physical can also be so symbolic. The toothpick is often depicted in literature as a stand-in for idleness or smugness. A character with a toothpick in his mouth is relaxed, but also slightly arrogant, detached, in control, never rushed. There's a power in that, too, in occupying space while doing something so small. A pick between the teeth is not just oral hygiene. It is a gesture of dismissal, of finality, of having eaten one's fill, literally and metaphorically. And yes, sometimes it goes wrong. There are stories, grim little anecdotes, of people choking on them, swallowing them in sleep, piercing their gums and requiring surgery. One 19th century physician wrote of pick-induced perforations as a rare but memorable medical emergency, a reminder that even the smallest tool, if used without care, can cause real harm. But for the most part, it serves gently, almost apologetically. Unlike the knife, it does not cut. Unlike the fork, it does not stab. It dislodges. It removes. It heals in its own modest way. I suppose what fascinates me most, after all these years, is how easily we pass by it. We notice the fork. We notice the spoon. We even have little jokes about the spork. But the toothpick, it disappears into the napkin, into the after-meal haze, into the shadows of the table, and yet remove it entirely, and the ritual of eating feels somehow unfinished. The performance lacks its coda. Something is left behind, both in the mouth and in the mood. This museum is full of such things. Unseen essentials. Quiet co-stars. I've grown to prefer them to the flashier exhibits. Give me the safety pin over the sword, the pencil stub over the compass, the toothpick over the jeweled chalice, because in these you find the human condition not as it wishes to be remembered, but as it actually is, unpolished, practical, and when observed closely enough, oddly beautiful. Sometimes, when I stand too long in front of this particular display, I start to imagine alternate lives for the toothpick. Not improvements, no, that would miss the point, but alternate realities. Variants in history where its shape changed just slightly, or its use became something else entirely. What if, for instance, it had remained a symbol of nobility, a kind of dental scepter used only by the elite, crafted from ivory or onyx and stored in velvet cases? Would we still feel so comfortable discarding it after a single use? Or perhaps in another world it became currency, small carved tokens passed between merchants, each notched with patterns to represent value, a toothpick economy. The fragility of the medium might have even served to prevent hoarding. Too many, and they'd simply snap. But we live in this world, and in this one, the toothpick remains exactly what it is, a temporary tool for a temporary problem. And there's something honest in that. We live surrounded by things that promise permanence and deliver none, technologies that promise to last, platforms that vanish in months, ideologies that collapse under their own slogans. But the toothpick never promised more than it gave. It knew its role from the beginning. There's a box in the archives, small, unlabeled, tucked behind a stack of discarded exhibits, that contains novelty toothpicks from the 1950s. Bright colors, humorous slogans. One is shaped like a sword. Another has a tiny plastic duck perched on top. Gimmicks, toys. Yet even these, ridiculous as they are, still fulfill the same core function. Strip away the laughter, and they are still small sticks, carved to a point, waiting to be useful for a moment and then forgotten again. And what a metaphor that is for us, for how we spend our lives chasing adornment, decoration, external flair, when in truth our functions are often quiet, necessary, and mostly invisible. We want to be seen as valuable before we are even needed. The toothpick, by contrast, never introduces itself. It simply waits. There are days when I envy that, to wait without complaint, to know your purpose so thoroughly you never need to seek another, to exist in simplicity, neither praised nor mourned. Museums are full of objects that scream for remembrance. The toothpick is one of the few that whispers, "I was there." That is enough. And when you think about it, what object has seen more unguarded moments? The sigh of relief after a heavy meal, the pause before a difficult conversation, the silence in a car parked on a late-night roadside with only the glove compartment's rattle as witness. These aren't headline moments, but they're real. They're human. They are, in the truest sense, ours. A curator friend of mine, he manages a collection of obsolete medical equipment in Copenhagen, once told me he couldn't bring himself to archive a used toothpick. It's too intimate, he said, too contaminated with someone's day. And I understood what he meant. Unlike a coin or a comb or a quill, the toothpick crosses a boundary. It enters the mouth. It brushes against the self in a way few objects do. It holds traces of a person, however briefly, so deeply that preserving it feels invasive. But here's the thing, we did preserve one. Only one. Sealed in a narrow glass vial, sterilized beyond reason, labeled simply specimen numero 7. It isn't remarkable to look at. It's not gold. It's not ancient. It's just slightly frayed at one end and tinged with the faintest discoloration. Yet it humbles the room around it. Visitors glance at it, puzzled, and then quietly they linger, as if trying to understand why something so unassuming deserves a spotlight. That, I think, is the real point of all this. The museum, the storytelling, the glass case, not to elevate the object beyond its nature, but to show that its nature is the elevation, that an item does not need grandeur to matter, that even the smallest things, especially the smallest things, shape the rhythms of the daily life in ways that define us far more than monuments ever could. So when people ask me, often half joking, why the toothpick, I no longer give the long answer. I just say, because no one else would. That's reason enough. And perhaps one day, when someone finds a broken pick beneath a floorboard or hidden in the folds of an old jacket, they'll pause, just long enough to wonder, just long enough to feel that tiny twinge of connection, the thread that ties us, not through great speeches or declarations, but through actions so small we barely notice we share them. And isn't that, in the end, what history truly is? There are moments, rare but real, when I think the toothpick is trying to tell us something, not in the paranoid way that one might suspect a haunted doll, nor in the romantic delusion that a well-worn book might whisper its former reader's secrets. No, the toothpick doesn't speak in words or meanings. It speaks in presence, in timing, in the way it never arrives too early or lingers too long, like a friend who knows exactly when to leave. We spend so much of our lives accumulating information, credentials, photos, passwords, unopened parcels. And yet the things that stick with us, really stay, are almost always the ones that ask nothing. A letter in someone else's handwriting, a stone from a beach, a quiet glance that said everything without a single sound. In this way, the toothpick is not an object so much as an echo of behavior, a reminder that not everything must announce itself to matter. I once met a man in Kyoto, a retired clockmaker, who told me he used toothpicks not for teeth or cleaning, but to align the tiny gears of antique timepieces. The wood, he said, has just enough give. He showed me one, stained with grease and time, its tip dulled from use. It knows its limits, he added, tapping the pick against the table. It breaks when it should. I don't think he meant only the wood. Isn't that the peculiar paradox of the toothpick? That it is strong precisely because it knows how to yield. Push too hard, and it fractures, yes, but in that moment, it's not failing. It's fulfilling its design. No drama, no resistance, just surrender. Purpose served, end accepted, and still we try to improve it. We coat it in fluoride. We flavor it with cinnamon or tea tree oil. We invent dispensers with spring mechanisms and sanitary seals. We turn it, briefly, into a product again. Because deep down, we dislike the idea of something that cannot be upgraded. We want progress. We want features. We want to believe that even the smallest things can become better if we just try harder. But the toothpick resists that narrative, not out of defiance, simply because it doesn't need us the way we need it. It already is. And if that bothers us, perhaps the problem is not in the object, but in the gaze. People often ask whether this museum is a joke. Isn't it ironic, they say, peering at the displays, looking for a wink I never offer? Are you mocking the object, or us? And I always respond the same way. Neither. Because reverence and irony aren't opposites, they're twins. They both demand attention. They both ask you to look again. And when you do look again, you start to see just how intricately our lives are bound to things we consider beneath notice. The weight of a fork, the hinge of a cabinet, the scratch of a zipper, the snap of a toothpick. Little mechanisms in the machinery of everyday grace. In that sense, perhaps the toothpick is less an object and more a signal, a marker of transition, from meal to rest, from public to private, from appetite to reflection. And isn't that, in a strange way, what rituals are built from? Not grand gestures, but repeated motions, over and over, until they become meaningful, simply through repetition. In some cultures, they use toothpicks as part of purification rites. The idea being that what has served the body must now be released. A kind of practical animism. I find that deeply moving. Not because I believe the pick has a soul, but because I believe we do, and we project that soul into what we touch, into the tools we use, into the routines we build around care. There is, after all, no such thing as a neutral object. Only objects we've stopped bothering to read. The next time you see one, whether in a glass at a restaurant or beneath the seat of your car, I encourage you not to pick it up, but to notice it, to register the faint outline of its form, the memory of the hand that may have used it, the tiny story that ended there, too small to be written down. Because if you can learn to see that, to really see it, then nothing is boring anymore. Not even here, especially not here. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the forest, not the one behind the museum, where tourists go to take photos of things that pretend to be wild, but a real forest, a forest of birch and bamboo and pine before the blade arrives, before the steaming and peeling and shaving begins, a forest full of waiting, of trees unaware that one day they will be rendered into splinters for the briefest interlude between meat and mint tea. We rarely think of objects as having ancestry, but they do, and the ancestry of the toothpick is long, green, and vertical. It sways in the wind and creaks in frost and speaks in the language of rings and sap. A single pick may begin in a tree 100 years old. It may have stood through wars and weddings unnoticed, and then one day it is cut down, not for planks, not for paper, not for fire, but for this, a stick so small it will vanish after its first task, a life traded for the removal of a seed husk between teeth. Is that wasteful? Is it reverent? I can never decide. Some days I think we're cruel, that we take far more than we need, then disguise it in plastic wrappers with smiling logos. Other days I think we are simply human, that we need small comforts to survive the vast machinery of the world. And if a tree must fall so that we may feel momentarily clean, perhaps that is not desecration. Perhaps that is the price of being alive and trying. You see, the story of the toothpick is also the story of thresholds, the tiny points at which one thing becomes another. Tree to sliver, object to gesture, need to memory. It is transformation on the smallest possible scale, and for that reason alone, it deserves to be noticed. In the archives, there's a set of photographs from the 1930s. Black and white, unremarkable at first glance. A woman in a factory, a scarf around her hair, guiding toothpicks into boxes with a flat wooden paddle. Her expression is neutral, not tired, not smiling, simply present. I've stared at that photo more times than I can count. There's something in her posture, the way her hand hovers above the stream of pointed sticks, that suggests a kind of knowledge we've lost. Not intellectual, not artistic, but manual, the kind of knowing that lives in the fingers, in repetition, in callus and touch. She packed thousands, tens of thousands, each identical, each anonymous, each eventually lifted, used, broken, forgotten, and yet, without her, they do not exist. I sometimes think about making her the centerpiece of the exhibit, not the toothpick, her, a still image of the human machinery behind the mechanical one, but I worry no one would understand. They'd ask what she made, and I would say, she made absence. She made the thing you don't think about, and in doing so, shaped the moment you didn't notice. That is a kind of art, too. We tend to believe that meaning requires permanence. Statues, books, signatures. But what if the truest meanings are the ones that pass through us without staying? touch that steadies, the glance that confirms, the stick that clears the way for a word to be spoken with confidence, because the tooth is no longer caught. What if legacy isn't what remains, but what allows? The toothpick doesn't ask for memory. It enables it. That is enough. And maybe, just maybe, that's more than most things ever do. It occurs to me from time to time that the toothpick may be one of the few tools left untouched by ideology. That is, it has no politics. No nation has ever declared it a national symbol. No revolution has been fought over its design. It has not been enlisted in manifestos. It does not appear in flags, and no anthem has sung its praise. It is, in the truest sense, an object outside belief, too small, too practical, too unimpressive to be caught in the gears of cause. And yet, I wonder, quietly, if that's exactly why it survives. There's a kind of safety in being ignored, a freedom in being beneath notice. While history roars in parades and power shifts, the toothpick remains in the pocket, in the drawer, on the table beside the check. It endures because it does not matter enough to threaten anything. But it does matter. You only need it once to know that. In my years here, I've seen hundreds of visitors pass by this display case without stopping. And then, occasionally, someone will freeze. Mid-stride, they'll tilt their head, lean in, and there it is, the flicker of recognition, as if the object has whispered, "You know me," not intimately, not emotionally, but familiarly, like the click of a seatbelt, the sound of a zipper, the weight of a house key, the small, repeated rituals that shape our days without ever announcing themselves. I once met a retired customs officer who told me that toothpicks were among the most common, forgotten objects in people's shows as luggage, fallen between the folds of fabric, caught in the corners of bags, harmless, unintentional, present without reason. It's like they follow people, he said, like ghosts of meals past. And in a way, he wasn't wrong. The toothpick is a postscript, an epilogue to consumption. It appears only after the appetite has been sated, the plates cleared, the wine dwindled to sediment. It is what remains when there is nothing left to want. Not celebratory, not mournful, just a necessary. Perhaps that's why so many writers have failed to capture it. There is no drama in a thing that arrives after the plot is over. It cannot be the climax, nor the twist, nor the metaphor that redeems the arc. It's what happens when everything else has already happened. And yet, isn't that precisely where meaning lives? In the aftermath. In the breath you take after saying something irreversible. In the silence between two people who have run out of words, but not yet out of presence. That is the territory of the toothpick. There's a small restaurant in Lisbon, anonymous, slightly damp, still lit by yellow bulbs and clinking glasses, where they keep a single jar of toothpicks behind the counter. But instead of offering them freely, they hand you one, like a relic, with 2 fingers. Eye contact, no words. It's strange, beautiful even. I asked the waiter once why they do it that way. He shrugged. Because it marks the end, he said, and every end deserves to be noticed. I've never forgotten that. You see, most objects shout. The smartphone pings, the kettle whistles, the car beeps, but the toothpick waits in silence. It doesn't tell you when to use it. It doesn't compete for your attention. It is only there when you realize something is slightly wrong, slightly out of place, and then quietly it helps you make things right again. Not permanently, not profoundly, but enough. And that, in this noisy world, is no small thing. If you ask someone to name an invention that changed the world, they will not say the toothpick. They will say the wheel, the compass, the printing press, electricity, flight, silicon, all grand movements, all thunderous in scale. But if you look closer, really closer, you will find that the architecture of civilization is not built on breakthroughs alone. It is built on interruption, on all the little ways we correct, pause, adjust, the tiny moments where something goes wrong and we reach without thinking for a solution so ingrained in our behavior we forget it was invented at all. The toothpick, in that sense, is not a solution to a problem. It is a permission to stop, to repair, to clear the smallest obstruction before it becomes something else. Discomfort, distraction, silence. That, too, is civilization. Of course, in our digital era, the toothpick has found new life, not in the mouth, but in the ports and cracks of our machines. People now use them to clean charging docks, reset phones, eject SIM cards. I've even seen one used to silence a laptop fan by wedging it between the blades, an improvised, slightly dangerous fix that worked just long enough. The modern pick is less oral, more technological. The stick remains, the task changes. Isn't that the fate of all enduring things? To evolve by accident, to become useful again in new contexts. Not by reinvention, but by being available. I've heard some curators, especially the younger ones, call such objects transitional artifacts. Things that exist in the gap between what we needed yesterday and what we think we need tomorrow. But I think that's too tidy, too academic. It makes it sound like the object has no will, no shape, no weight, as if it is merely a ghost of relevance. But the toothpick insists. It keeps appearing, quietly. Even now, in a world of silicone-tipped brushes and ultrasonic dental jets, you will still find one in your hotel nightstand, in the paper sleeve of your airline meal, in the corner of a borrowed drawer. It outlasts innovation not because it is superior, but because it is sufficient. And sufficiency, that deeply unsexy word, is what makes civilization possible. We tend to glorify optimization, the latest, the fastest, the smartest. But the truth is, most of life is held together by things that simply work. Not perfectly, not beautifully, but reliably. You do not need the best tool. You need the tool that's there. The toothpick is always there. And so we keep returning to it, not out of nostalgia, not even out of preference, but because something in its presence tells us, you can fix this. Not the world, not your past, but this one thing, this seed, this flake, this pause. And for a moment, you are no longer undone by what is small. You are in command again. I've often said that if the museum had to burn, and I assure you, I do not wish it to, it would be the toothpick I'd save first. Not the rare things, not the glittering ones, but this, a strip of processed wood, unassuming, unsentimental, unheroic, because it is the only object here that never pretends to be anything other than exactly what it is. And in a world full of performance, that alone is radical. I sometimes wonder what it says about us, that we invented something designed to be thrown away, not as an accident, not as a compromise, but by design. The toothpick is made to end. No sharpening, no refilling, no repair. Just use, discard, repeat. We call that convenience. We call that modernity. But it is also, if we are honest with ourselves, a kind of practiced indifference. We make tools we do not mourn, and yet, in its very disposability, the toothpick demands a curious kind of trust. Trust that it will not break before the task is done. Trust that it will not splinter in the wrong place. Trust that this thin, pointed nothing will do exactly what we hope, just once, before disappearing into a napkin or trash bin or coat pocket, never to be thought of again. There is something profound in that, because trust, in its deepest form, is not earned by grand gestures. It is earned by small reliabilities, by showing up again and again in quiet ways that ask nothing in return. We do not love the toothpick, but we rely on it. And sometimes that's the more honest relationship. I've read papers, dry, technical things, about toothpick testing, about pressure resistance, fiber length, moisture content. There are, believe it or not, ISO standards for toothpicks. Imagine that, an international agreement on how breakable a tiny stick should be. Engineers in conference halls agreeing on the degree of pointiness, the angle of taper, the smoothness of the shaft. We laugh, perhaps, but consider the opposite. A world where nothing is standard, where every pick behaves differently. Too sharp and you bleed. Too dull and the task fails. Too wet and it bends. Too dry and it snaps mid-use. In that world, the toothpick would be chaos, inconsistency disguised as spontaneity. So instead, we agreed, silently, across continents, that this thing, this trivial, forgettable, utterly minor thing, deserved to be dependable. And that, I think, is what makes it beautiful. Not in form, not in fame, but in function. Because beneath all the grand inventions of history, all the empires and machines and silicon dreams, lies the same unglamorous truth. We are animals with teeth, and teeth trap things, and those things must come out. It is not noble, it is not symbolic, it is necessary, and the tool that serves that necessity does not need praise, it needs only to work. And so, each time we reach for one, whether wrapped in tissue, or loose in a dispenser, or pulled from a cocktail, it is a quiet reaffirmation of that unspoken contract. This will do. Not impress, not inspire, but do. And in a world flooded with objects that promise too much and deliver too little, perhaps that is the rarest thing of all. There's a moment, infinitesimal really, that happens every time you use a toothpick. You felt it. Everyone has. That fraction of a second when the task is complete, and you pause with the object still in hand, not yet discarded, not quite needed anymore. A liminal space between use and disposal, between purpose and obsolescence. And in that moment, the toothpick becomes a kind of memory, not a sentimental one. No violins swell, no childhood visions appear, but a functional memory, a gesture stored in the hand, a small satisfaction, the way your fingers know how to hold it without instruction, the way you flick it, turn it, press it just so. As if the body remembers things the mind cannot be bothered to. I've seen that moment replayed again and again in this museum, not just here at the toothpick display, but in every quiet corner. People staring at the ordinary, and then slowly, almost involuntarily, reenacting the gesture. A hand lifting, fingers miming the movement. Not performative, not ironic. Just remembering we forget how much of our behavior is built on repetition. You learn to use a toothpick the same way you learn to tie your shoes, by watching, by trying, by failing and trying again. No manual, no tutorial, just the slow, quiet absorption of movement. And now it's yours, as native to your fingers as your handwriting, and just as invisible to you until someone points it out. There is a theory I once read, buried in a dull anthropological volume, that claimed human culture advanced not through innovation, but through the refinement of gestures, that every leap in development was preceded not by thought, but by the hand learning how to hold something better. Not new tools, but better grips. The toothpick supports that theory, because no one thinks about how they hold it. No one reflects on the angle of insertion, the rotation of the wrist, the precision of pressure. And yet everyone knows, somehow. And that silent choreography, passed down without word or lesson, connects us more deeply than most laws or doctrines ever could. The museum has an old video loop, silent, grainy, black and white, of various people using toothpicks. It plays in the background near the exit. Most visitors don't notice it, but I do. And what fascinates me isn't the pick itself. It's the posture, the tilt of the head, the flicker of the eyes, the moment of satisfaction when the task is done. You can see it, that tiny flicker of completion, of relief, not dramatic, but sincere. The job is finished. The mouth is clear. The world, in some small way, is right again. Is that not, in essence, what we're all looking for? Not happiness, not fame, but the resolution of discomfort, the return to a state where nothing demands us. No itch, no pressure, no grain of popcorn lodged in the gum line of our day. It's a small thing, but so too is breath, and no one questions its importance. I often think about the things we carry without noticing. A coin in the pocket, a receipt in a coat from last winter, a key we no longer remember the door for, and yes, sometimes a toothpick, caught in the lining of a bag, resting beside pens and lint and memories so small they've never even been named. And it's strange, isn't it, that these things survive with us longer than they're supposed to, that an object meant for a single use can linger, stashed away, forgotten, not by design, but by accident, or perhaps by something deeper than accident, by habit, by ritual, by the quiet refusal of the hand to let go of what once served it well. There is, after all, a difference between disposable and discardable, a difference we don't often acknowledge. I've spoken with archivists, real archivists, the kind who wear gloves and whisper to paper, who told me the hardest thing to categorize isn't to date the ancient or the rare, but the common, because no one thought to write it down. No one labeled it. No one framed it. It just appeared. It was there. It was used. And then it vanished again. The toothpick lives in that space, the unrecorded, the unremarked, but it also resists disappearance, because even if you never write about it, never think about it, never honor it, it returns. In drawers, in rest stops, in the mouths of men who stand outside cafes, arms crossed, chewing idly at the last splinter of their meal. It finds a way back into the story, quietly, patiently, like water, like time. I remember once, this was years ago, maybe longer, I was sitting in a small town bar in northern Finland, the kind of place with cracked leather stools and a single working jukebox. A man came in, ordered nothing, just walked to the bar, took a toothpick from a small jar, placed it between his teeth, and sat down by the window. He stayed there for 20 minutes, didn't speak, didn't drink, just chewed, then left. And something about that has stayed with me, because it wasn't about the teeth. It wasn't even about the object. It was a ritual, a return to form, a quiet reclamation of self in a space that demanded nothing and offered less. We think of tools as extensions of intent. Hammers extend the hand. Telescopes extend the eye. Phones extend the voice. But what exactly does a toothpick extend? Not power, not vision, not reach. Perhaps interiority. The sense of attending to the self. The small maintenance tasks that have no audience and no applause, but which nonetheless sustain us. Not self-care in the scented, commodified sense, but the older kind. The kind that happens behind the bathroom door, in silence, with focus, with respect. Yes, even that. Even this. Even a pointed piece of birch between thumb and forefinger, beneath flickering light, beside a plate still warm. That, too, is a gesture of care. Sometimes, when the lights dim and the museum closes for the night, I walk the halls not as a curator, but as a guest. I try to forget what I know. I try to see the displays not as artifacts, but as intrusions, interruptions of silence, asking to be acknowledged, and I always stop at the toothpick. Not because it is the most beautiful, not because it is the rarest, but because it is the most honest. There is no mystique to it, no aura, no effort to transcend itself. It exists precisely as it is, without pretense, without ambition. And perhaps that, in a world thick with ambition, is the most radical gesture of all. We don't talk about honesty in design anymore. We talk about aesthetics, about minimalism, about user experience. But honesty, that's not in vogue. Honesty is quiet, inconvenient. It doesn't sell well. It doesn't go viral. And yet, it is the thread that holds everything together. The toothpick does not lie about what it is. It doesn't promise more. It doesn't over-deliver. It does the job. Then it leaves, or snaps, or slips behind the couch. But in any case, it asks for nothing. And that makes it rare. I've heard it said, too often, probably, that we live in an age of disposability, that everything is designed to be replaced. Phones, shoes, friendships, meaning. But I don't think that's quite right. I think we live in an age where permanence pretends to matter, and everything disposable tries to hide that it is. Everything but the toothpick. The toothpick does not hide. It accepts. And there is a kind of peace in that. A kind of stillness that's hard to come by elsewhere. It doesn't compete. It doesn't decorate. It doesn't define taste or status or preference. It just waits, and when the time comes, it fulfills its role with such quiet clarity that we barely notice it did anything at all. And yet, how noticeable the world becomes when it is not there. Have you ever eaten corn on the cob and found yourself without one? Have you ever felt that small thing trapped, unreachable, just beyond the edge of the tongue, and realized, I have nothing sharp, nothing small, nothing right? In that moment, you remember the toothpick, not with fondness, but with urgency. You remember not what it looked like, but what it meant, what it allowed, and when it returns, pulled from the recesses of a drawer, or slipped from the fold of a napkin, it brings with it a breath, a release, the unspoken relief of something no longer stuck. That's the thing. The toothpick is not a hero, but it delivers resolution. Not grand, not transformative, but enough. And in a world constantly craving more, enough is revolutionary. I once overheard a visitor say, half joking, as they passed the toothpick display, "Why bother putting something like that in a museum?" And I remember thinking, not angrily, not defensively, just plainly, that they had misunderstood the point of both the object and the museum, because this place was never meant to glorify what is grand. It was built to hold still the things that slip through the cracks, the things we use and need and lose, the things that form the texture of our days without ever making themselves known. The museum exists because of the toothpick, not the other way around. To walk past it without looking is to reenact the very forgetfulness the museum was built to interrupt. It is, in that way, our most important piece. You see, we tend to value what lasts, what resists time. We think permanence equals worth, but permanence is loud. It demands to be seen. The toothpick doesn't demand. It performs its task, accepts its fate, and disappears, often broken, often soiled, never kept. It is a participant in the moment, never the memory. And yet, I wonder, if we built a monument to every toothpick that had ever existed, how tall would it be? How far would it reach? Would it be enough to show us how much of our lives are held together by things we never thought to think? I sometimes think of the toothpick as a kind of punctuation mark, not the exclamation point, not grand or insistent, not the question mark. It does not invite ambiguity. No, the toothpick is the period, the full stop, the end of the sentence that was your meal, the final detail that completes the form. You don't write a novel of toothpicks, but you do need them to finish a paragraph. And perhaps that's the key. It is not the object that's extraordinary. It's the timing, the context, the way it steps in only when the moment is right and steps out again without asking for credit. We could all learn something from that. This museum, this hall, these displays, they are not temples. They are reminders that even what is small, even what is broken, even what is meant to be thrown away matters, not because it is rare, not because it is beautiful, but because it did something. And that, in the end, is the only measure worth keeping. At a certain point, you stop thinking about the object itself and start thinking about what it represents. Not in a metaphorical way, not as symbol, not as stand-in, but in the quiet register of behavior, of ritual, of rhythm. You realize the toothpick was never the subject at all. It was the aperture, the frame, the thing through which we see the small mechanisms of being human. And once you've seen it, you start to notice the others. The folded edge of a receipt used as a bookmark, the twist of a bread bag tie, the crumpled ticket stub that someone kept, not because it meant anything, but because they didn't know where else to put it. These are not treasures, but they are traces of presence, of usage, of intention. However slight, the toothpick lives in that category. Objects that are evidence of a life being lived. And what a radical notion that is, that something so brief, so ignorable, could be proof of care, of interruption, of the instinct to adjust. I once read an essay, I've forgotten the author now, and maybe that's fitting, that argued the true sign of a civilization was not its monuments, but its maintenance tools, its brooms, its buttons, its ways of repairing what could not be replaced. Not the glories it built, but the systems it relied on to prevent collapse. Quietly, repeatedly, without thanks. And so we arrive here, in this gallery, in front of this glass, looking down at a piece of birch no longer than your finger, and we try to make sense of it. We try to assign it value, or history, or meaning. But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe it isn't about what the toothpick means. Maybe it's about what it allows. The smile given without embarrassment after a meal. The breath drawn freely. The small return to equilibrium. Not dramatic. Not poetic. Just correct. And in that act of correction, of restoring some tiny balance, we glimpse, if only for a moment, the shape of something larger. Not perfection, but care. And that, in a way, is the whole point of this place. Not to make the boring sacred, but to remind us that the sacred is often boring, until it isn't, until you need it, until it's gone. It's always the smallest things that vanish without ceremony, not with a bang, not with a fade to black, just not there anymore. The drawer where you always found one is empty. The napkin that used to hold it now holds nothing. The jar on the bar counter, once full, now forgotten behind promotional menus. You don't notice its absence at first. You adjust, you chew mint gum, you press your tongue harder against the molar, you move on. But then, one day, you find yourself in need. That precise, familiar discomfort, a seed skin, a pepper flake, something invisible but undeniable. You reach, and the toothpick is not there. It is in that absence that you realize what it was. Because function, when perfectly fulfilled, becomes invisible. You don't remember the elevator that didn't break. You don't praise the doorknob that opened smoothly, but remove it, disrupt the sequence, and you feel it all at once. The jarring wrongness, the interruption of expectation. That is the paradox of all quiet tools. They define the world by not being noticed, but the moment they fail or disappear, they define it by everything they no longer allow. I've spoken with people who've tried to design the next toothpick. Reusable ones, ergonomic ones, ones made from cornstarch or coconut husk or graphite polymer. They mean well. They want to improve, to innovate, to give the object its upgrade. And yet, none of them last. Because innovation here misses the point. The toothpick is not behind the times. It is outside them. It does not evolve because it has no need to. It does not disrupt because it never claimed to. It simply fits into the cracks of the world, into the narrow gaps that nothing else quite reaches. That is its genius and its curse, because in a culture obsessed with novelty, we overlook the brilliance of sufficiency. We are told that everything can be better, sleeker, smarter, more sustainable. But sometimes the better thing is the one that asked nothing in the first place. No one ever made an app for food stuck in your teeth. No algorithm has replaced the feeling of something suddenly dislodged. And so the toothpick remains. Not through marketing, not through nostalgia, but through fit. It fits the task, the hand, the moment, and in that fit, it becomes irreplaceable. You don't need a subscription model for it. You don't need instructions. You just need presence. One toothpick, 1 second, one simple, pointed correction, and then the world continues. That's the beauty. That's the entire story. And most people never notice it happened. Sometimes I wonder how many toothpicks are in the ground. Not metaphorically, in actual soil, in landfills, in compost heaps, beneath floorboards, trapped in time, stripped of purpose, indistinguishable from twigs or shavings or the kindling of forgotten fires. Millions, billions more. But then I think perhaps that is where they belong, not preserved in amber, not cast in bronze, but gone because they did their job. They existed in the space between a need and its resolution, and then rightly they left. Not all objects should be remembered. Some should be released. And the toothpick, I think, understands this better than most. It has no delusions of permanence. It was never meant to endure. It was made, quite precisely, to vanish. Not through destruction, but through completion. Its end is not failure. Its end is a sign that it worked. And there is a rare dignity in that. We are surrounded by things that resist endings. Phones that update themselves endlessly. Stories stretched past their meaning. Plastics that refuse to decompose. And yet the toothpick, humble as it is, offers a kind of ecological honesty. I was here. I helped. That is enough. I sometimes imagine what it would be like if people behaved like toothpicks, not to be used, no, but to arrive quietly, serve briefly, and exit without demanding legacy. To see an obstacle, remove it, and move on. No monument, no plaque. Just the silent knowledge that something small went right because you were there. There's a beauty in that form of usefulness. A form that does not centralize itself. A form that understands its place is not at the center of attention, but at the edge, where things stick, where things go unnoticed, where things get stuck. The toothpick, after all, lives at the margins of the plate, of the mouth, of the moment. And perhaps that's why we feel something when it's missing. Not a loss, exactly, but a small friction, a reminder that not everything needs to be important to matter. And matter it does. In the aftertaste, in the afterthought, in the strange quiet of something that worked and left nothing behind. A toothpick does not ask to be kept, and that, perhaps, is why it keeps showing up. There's a kind of freedom in things that don't ask to be remembered. Not because they lack meaning, but because they refuse to trade in it. The toothpick doesn't try to endure, to inspire, to transcend. It has no afterlife. It offers nothing but presence. And that, in its own unassuming way, is a kind of wisdom. We live in a time obsessed with legacy, with footprint, with making a difference. Every act is documented, every thought archived. We are encouraged, no, expected, to leave a trace. But the toothpick resists that entirely. It says, be useful, then leave. No inscription, no echo, no need to be seen again. I once met a botanist, retired, soft-voiced, endlessly patient, who told me that the most important parts of an ecosystem are almost always the least visible. Root fungi, microbes, the thin networks beneath the soil that let water move and minerals flow. They do not bloom. They do not bear fruit, but without them, the forest dies. The toothpick, I think, is a tool built in that same spirit. It's not meant to be admired. It's meant to be relied on. Briefly, precisely, without fanfare. And when it is gone, there is no void, only quiet satisfaction. The job was done. The interruption ended. The system reset. It's easy to overlook what that says about us. that we've created something so small, so simple, and so perfectly adapted to a need we barely acknowledge. We didn't over-engineer it. We didn't refine it endlessly. We stopped correctly when it was enough. And then we let it go. In that decision lives a rare kind of design humility. Most things are burdened by the need to be better than their predecessors. Phones compete. Cars evolve. Shoes brag about cushioning you didn't ask for. But the toothpick, it's still a stick, still a point, still a gesture of intervention, and nothing more. And that might be its greatest contribution, not the object itself, but the principle it embodies, that sufficiency is not failure, that quiet things are not weak, that sometimes doing exactly what you are meant to do just once is more than enough. We should have more tools like that, more tools that do not demand our praise, but deserve it nonetheless. More things that do not aspire to shape the world, but keep it from falling apart. One flake of food, one moment of discomfort, one breath at a time. I sometimes imagine what it would be like if this exhibit were gone, not dismantled, not packed away, just absent. The glass case empty, no plaque, no light above it, just a space, a pause between objects, a silence in the sequence. Would anyone notice? Would they stop? Would they sense that something was missing, or simply move on to the next display, the next story, the next proof that something once mattered? And if they did notice, would they know what it was? Probably not. Most wouldn't. And maybe that's fitting, because the absence of the toothpick doesn't announce itself. It unsettles. Like a word missing from a sentence. A hinge that creaks when it shouldn't. It is the kind of absence that makes you frown without knowing why. And in that frown is the memory of all the times it was there, and you never thanked it. That's how small things teach. Not by performance, by withdrawal. And the older I get, the more I respect that kind of teaching. You see, museums are often accused of nostalgia, of trying to freeze the past in amber. But this museum, this quiet, curious place filled with things no one bothers to name, was never about preserving. It was about pointing, not to glory, not to failure, but to the unnoticed, the in-between, the part of life that holds its shape not through grand declarations, but through consistency. The toothpick embodies that, not just as a tool, but as a principle. It doesn't serve identity. It doesn't represent culture. It simply exists to correct, then exits. And in that gesture is something deeply human, something older than language, deeper than habit. The instinct to remove what doesn't belong, to clear the path, to set things right before we move on. How many times has it done that for you? How many times has it entered your hand without a second thought, done its work, and disappeared into a napkin, a trash bin, a memory too small to keep? And still, it comes back, again and again, not because it insists, but because it fits, not because we remember it, but because we need it, not because we love it, but because we trust it. And there, I think, is its quiet triumph. And so we arrive at the end, not of the object, of course. The toothpick doesn't end, not really. It breaks, it's thrown away, it vanishes, but it doesn't conclude. There's no arc to complete, no transformation to reward. It begins and ends in the same breath, a tool that simply does what it must and then disappears. But here, in this hall, we allow it to linger just a little longer, to be seen to be named, to be remembered, if only briefly, before it returns to its rightful place, the background. I have often said, perhaps too often, that museums are not homes for the extraordinary. They are shelters for the overlooked. We do not protect things because they shine, but because they risk being forgotten. And sometimes the object that most deserves a case is the one that never would have asked for one. The toothpick never asked. But here it is, and here we are. The strange thing is, after all this, after all the words, the history, the trivia, the philosophy, I find I still don't feel as though I've captured it. Not fully. Not finally. Because to understand the toothpick is to understand its resistance to meaning, its refusal to be more than it is. It cannot be elevated, only observed, and what we observe, we begin to care for, and what we care for, we begin to see differently. So perhaps that's the work of this museum. Not to celebrate the boring, but to reveal it, to show how much of life is built on things we step over, reach past, throw away, to remind us that presence is not always loud, that function is not always flashy, that loyalty can be quiet, and the toothpick stubbornly, silently, consistently has been loyal to the hand, to the task, to the moment. So the next time you use one, and you will, pause, just for a second, feel the weight of it, the texture, the shape. Remember this haul. Remember this case. Remember, not because it matters, but because you can. And then, let it go. Let it do what it was made to do. Let it vanish. Let it be enough. Because it was. It always was.